Okay, good afternoon, everybody. For those who are joining us, please introduce yourselves in the chat. Give us your name, the organization that you work for, and the country that you represent as well. We will begin our discussion now. So I'm going to start with some brief introductions. My name is Maxine Jonker, and I work as a project manager in the Division of Environmental Health at the University of Cape Town. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our UCT Pesticide Discussion Forum. Today, I'm just here to facilitate the discussion, and so you'll hear me come on every now and then, but it's really up to our presenters who are bringing their expertise today and all of you participants who will be engaging with us in the chat. So just a welcome from us at the division, and we would just like to say a huge thanks to our supporters. This discussion forum is supported and funded from Sweden through the Swedish Chemicals Agency. And I've introduced myself, so I'd like to introduce Tatum Fowler next. She is working in the background as our technical and administrative support, and she will be helping with all the technical things today. So if you have any issues, please feel free to contact Tatum. We've been introducing ourselves in the chat. If you've just joined us now, please feel free to just give us your name, country, and the organization that you represent in the chat. We would love to know who you are and who is joining us for this discussion today. So the purpose of UCT's Pesticide Discussion Forum is to bring representatives from different regions, sectors, and stakeholder groups together to foster a mutually supporting consortium of stakeholders and to discuss various issues related to pesticides. This network is particularly to build the capacity of regulators, researchers, and NGOs in low and middle income countries and to discuss emerging issues. We hope to achieve this by learning from each other, sharing information and data, identifying gaps, and problem solve collectively to reduce and prevent pesticide poisonings and environmental contamination with a view to a toxic-free future for the next generation. So I'm going to just briefly explain the process of the discussion before we get started. So it's very important to know that this is not a webinar, but rather a chat discussion. And this means that we have brief presentations from our presenters. They will present for a couple of minutes, between 5 and 10 minutes. And then we will pose a question to the audience and you will discuss this in the chat. The question will be posted in the chat. And so we will ask you to respond in the chat and send us your thoughts about the question. So that's just to say, please keep your microphones muted and your cameras off during this discussion, just to support bandwidth of everyone that is joining today. This is a non-partisan discussion. We respect all viewpoints and we value all input. Please include your country and organization when you respond in the chat, and please feel free to engage with others' responses as well as our presenters who will be reading the chat and answering your questions. So if you have questions for them, please feel free to post it in there, and we will engage with your responses as much as we can. So basically the flow of this discussion, we will start by just getting our presenters to introduce themselves briefly, and then we will begin with a first presentation. This will be followed by a question. This question will be posted in the chat and we will discuss it for a few minutes. Towards the end of our discussion time, a 5-minute warning will be posted in the chat, just letting you know that there's 5 minutes left to discuss, so you need to send your final thoughts. And throughout each question that we are discussing, we will be posting polls that you will be able to see on the screen. We post these polls using Mentimeter, which is a live polling mechanism. And so you can vote and you'll be able to see people's responses. It is anonymous, but you can see people's responses and what they're responding to the poll as they vote. So I'm going to hand over to our presenters. They're going to come on and just briefly introduce themselves. So I will hand over to Santos first. Santos, welcome, and please could you just give us a brief introduction of yourself?
Thank you very much. Good day to everybody. And that picture there was taken some years ago. I'm older now. My name is Santos Virgilio from Angola. I work as the focal point, second focal point for the country, and also second focal point for the Africa region. So I'm in that condition that I came to share with you some thoughts on the issue that you proposed today. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Santos. My picture is also some years old, and as you can see from the video, I'm younger now. And
I'm not photogenic. That's why I figured off my video.
I currently work with the University of Edinburgh at a project called the Centre for Pesticide Suicide Prevention. That project is supporting initiatives dealing with highly hazardous pesticides in many regions and countries around the world, with the objective of reducing the number of people who die from intentional or accidental exposure to highly hazardous pesticides. I've been with this project for about 3.5 years. I also support a number of other projects independently. Prior to that, I worked with FAO for 18 years, running their field programs and the policy programs on pesticides management. And I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Mark. So I think we'll begin with our presentations. Santos will be taking us into an introduction, and that will take us till about 2:15, and then we will move on to our first question. So Santos, you can take the floor.
Thank you very much again. I'm like the spokesperson for the Africa region stakeholders on SciChem, which is the strategic approach for sound management of chemicals and wastes. And in the process of the implementation of IP4, we came up with some thoughts, and we decided to submit an info document to be considered an IP42 meeting. And what's the aim of bringing this is to call people to join us and come up with a resolution from the ICCM5 to create a global alliance on HHPs, because they are being a problem for our population here in the continent. As you can see, the WHO has recognized it as a major public health concern issue. So we have to face it this way. Yeah, we can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, why we are proposing this? Because in 2015, during the ICCM5 and 4, sorry, it was already recognized that the highly hazardous pesticides were already recognized as issue of international concern. And that conference called for action to deal with these pesticides. So some years ago, let's say 7 years ago already, we are coming to the 18th year. Okay, that was the recommendation, that was the recognition, and people, organization, government were called to take actions to deal with the issue. But despite that recognition, up to now, very few action were taken. And because of that, many people across the African continent still dying, victims of HHPs. And also there are studies that shows that the general environment and the biodiversity of Africa region is already affected by HHPs. So this is the reason why we, Africa region, we are coming up with a proposal and asking you attending this meeting today to go, when you talk with your representatives to the SciChem, ask them to support our proposal So next slide. And there is a reality, and everybody knows that in Africa, we don't produce pesticides. We don't have the capacity of producing pesticides. So pesticides are produced elsewhere, out of Africa. And Africa is a net importer of pesticides. So everybody, they are bringing the pesticides here in our continent, in our region. And funny enough, where these HSPs are produced, themselves, they have banned the HSP in their countries, but they're still producing it exclusively to be sent to Africa, to export to Africa. And then the Africans, the farmers, and the consumers of Africa that have been affected by the impact of HSPs. So the victims are the Africans. Through the food chain, everybody is affected by highly hazardous pesticides. So there is a need for action to promote agriculture and human health, detoxified from HSP. How to make it? We found that a resolution can help to engage stakeholders to take action to deal with the issues that were supposed to be dealt with long ago. Next slide. And also, we didn't take it like only emotionally seeing things, and we decided to come up with this. So it was based on reflections, based on scientific evidence, either by WHO, by FAO, by UNEP, or by other research and academia, that if we come with this, if we decide, okay, let's ban the HSPs, taking into account the cost of banning it and the benefit we get, so they still have room to move forward without having lots of problems. Because in some countries, especially those countries where they produce the HSPs, they managed to phase out and even to ban. And it didn't affect much their agricultural productivity. So based on that, we believe that we can also force to go to that direction, and that will be cost effective for all of us. And also, there is a understanding and there is a knowledge that most farmers in Africa, especially in countries, most of the countries, the agriculture is based by family-based agriculture. So small farmers are the ones are producing to feed the countries. And those that don't have skills, even the agriculture skills are very poor, and they don't have skills to handle properly the chemicals, the agrotoxic and HSPs they have. So there are these figures saying that around 385 million cases of people have been unintentionally poisoned by HSPs. So, and also the public health is already affected in many of our countries. So these are evidence. Next slide. So there is an action needed. We need to convince relevant stakeholders to support this African position in order to become a global resolution on highly hazardous pesticides. Once again, I ask you to make actions, to talk to your government, participants to SAICM, in the next meeting in Nairobi to come and support the Africa position and to lobby for it in order to have that alliance and that resolution moving ahead. I think this is the last one, unless is there any other slide? Okay. I hand over to Mark now.
Great, thank you so much,
Thank you
Santos.
very much.
Yes. Thanks, Mark. You can present our question one background.
Thank you, Santos, for that background, which I think is very interesting, very timely, very relevant. The fact that the African group has come together to put forward this proposal emphasizes the need for action on highly hazardous pesticides. And while it has come as a proposal from the Africa region, the issues are no less important in other regions as well. And I think we do have some participants here from Asia, from the Caribbean, maybe from Latin America, from Europe. And I think that these issues can be discussed on a global level. So in terms of the discussion that we're going to move forward with now, the first question has been posed. And as a few words of introduction to that, I wanted to say, we already have a Stockholm Convention, which has banned a number of particularly harmful chemicals that are persistent, bioaccumulative, and mobile in the global environment. And discussions are ongoing on listing additional chemicals under that convention. We have the Rotterdam Convention, which provides an information system, really, for countries to be warned that certain chemicals are particularly hazardous, and they should be giving their prior informed consent to allow the import of those chemicals into their territory. We have the globally harmonized system for the classification of and labeling of chemicals that tells us which are the chemicals that are particularly harmful. We have the FAO-WHO International Code of Conduct on pesticide management, which provides guidance to countries on how they should be managing pesticides throughout their life cycle. And it includes specific recommendations to avoid the use of highly hazardous pesticides where the conditions of use don't allow sufficient protection to people and to the environment. We've got the Convention on Biological Diversity, which has just renegotiated its targets for the next decade or 15 years. And in that, they are calling for an international reduction of 60% in pesticide use. We have a number of regional highly hazardous pesticide strategies. This week, the East Africa Commission, regulators from its member countries, are meeting to discuss and finalize a strategy on highly hazardous pesticides. Just a few weeks ago, the Southern Africa Pesticide Regulators Forum also met to discuss a strategy on highly hazardous pesticides. So we have a lot of regional action that's taking place as well. And we have international trading standards that limit the use of certain chemicals in products that are going to be traded under their labels, like Rainforest Alliance or Fair Trade, for example. So there are a number of measures that are already out there. And the question really is, do we need another mechanism, such as this Highly Hazardous Pesticides Alliance, to take action on highly hazardous pesticides? And that's where we open this up for discussion. So Santos, if you'd like to maybe say a few words about why specifically we need an additional mechanism like this, on top of everything else that's in place, maybe that can help to guide the discussion. Otherwise, I think Maxine or Tatum will give instructions on how to proceed with the discussion amongst the participants. Thank you.
Yeah, very interesting question. And is not difficult to answer your question. So I can start by saying, okay, quantity of instruments doesn't mean quality of actions. So it has proven it is an issue of concern, but progress has been slow and uneven. There is almost nothing done because people still dying of HHPs. because there is no real actions. And those countries which are producing, which have already prohibited HFCs in their countries, they find in Africa a good market. They're still producing, they're still sending it to our countries. Although we have all these multilateral instruments, like the Stockholm, Rotterdam, and other conventions, but we know that there is the multitude and magnitude of social and economic problems in Africa weaken our institutions. That's why the HSP is still coming in our countries. Yes, there is a need for that. Thank you. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes, I think you raised some important points. Even though we have these mechanisms, there is limited action on HHP specifically, and we see that they continue to be traded and used, continue to cause harm around the world. So really, I can understand the call from regulators for some more concerted action specifically on these very harmful chemicals. And it has been said through in many documents and in many fora that really highly hazardous pesticides is a relatively small proportion of all the pesticides that are in use. So if we act on that relatively small number, we can solve a high proportion of the problems of toxicity, of impacts on biodiversity. So really action on HHPs will deliver substantial results for a relatively small effort on the part of regulators and others who are acting on this. And we're seeing some points coming up here. We've already seen that current instruments should cover the issue, so we don't really need a new one. Effective implementation of those instruments might do the job.
Great, thank you so much, Mark and Santos. I'm just going to quickly jump in. For those who maybe are not sure what we're doing at the moment, as you can see, there's a question posted on the screen. This question has also been posted in the chat, and we're all busy answering and putting our thoughts in the chat room. Santos and Mark, please feel free to have a look at what's going on in the chat and just engage with it. And we will post a poll question in a few minutes. But please continue to discuss question 1.
Yeah, but okay, that question in terms of saying that there are already some instruments that should be like reinforced or utilized to reach our goal. We are 54 countries, and most of our countries are parties to all these conventions. So we have seen that through the conventions, through the mechanism, especially financial mechanism in place, we cannot get there. We didn't get there. We will not get there, we are sure. And we tried and we tried again. So there is a need of engaging more stakeholders. And we have been battling, and still also from our region, that we in IP4, in the first session, we submitted a proposal on financial mechanism, involvement of private sector to be engaged in terms of funding projects on chemicals and waste management. So how to engage the private sector on this, because our key flag is, okay, we Africans don't produce chemicals. We consume chemicals, they come to us. And sometimes we are unable to deal with them because we don't have capacity, we don't have the technology, we don't have enough knowledge to deal with them. And when they happen, when the problem happens, they're already in our homeland. So we have to deal with them. So how we will deal with them if we don't have the resources for that? That's a big question. So when we come to this global alliance, we are coming also to to engage everybody, which is considered key stakeholders on this issue. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Xanthos. Yeah, there's a couple of points that I wanted to make based on my own experience of working in this field for some time. And one of the key points is a differentiation between legally binding mechanisms and voluntary mechanisms. Now, I worked for several years supporting the implementation of the International Code of Conduct on Pesticide Management, and I was responsible for leading the latest revision of that document, which is the one which is available now. And that was published in 2014, which is some time ago. Now, the legally binding instruments, such as the Rotterdam Convention and the Stockholm Convention, are heavy-duty instruments because they are legally binding. So they're negotiating them, getting new chemicals listed on them is a long and complex process. And we've seen over and over again attempts by countries to get chemicals listed on these conventions, and they are consistently blocked by stakeholders and by countries that have interests in protecting certain chemicals. So really, progress with those kind of mechanisms can be very, very slow. When there is progress, it's very effective because legally binding means that whatever is listed there is subject to all of the requirements of that convention, which in the case of Stockholm effectively means stopping production and use to the extent possible with some exemptions. In the case of Rotterdam, it doesn't mean that the chemicals are banned. It just means that there will be prior notification about trade in those chemicals. So, as I say, legally binding instruments are heavy weapons. But on the other hand, the more flexible approach of something like the Code of Conduct and SICAM, which is also not a legally binding instrument, allows countries and stakeholders who are involved in those processes to be much more flexible in the way they operate and in the way that those things are interpreted. So, for example, under the criteria that have been defined under the Code of Conduct for highly hazardous pesticides, leaves an opening for countries, for regulators to say, well, there are certain chemicals which aren't listed on the Stockholm Convention, the Rotterdam Convention, the Montreal Protocol. They're not classified by WHO as being class 1A or 1B toxins. Nevertheless, what we're finding under conditions of use in our country is that these chemicals are causing problems. So we have the flexibility under the Code of Conduct and the criteria for HHPs to define a chemical as an HHP, which elsewhere might not be listed. Now, what's also important is that countries are aware of this. So sharing information and learning from each other's experiences, not only which chemicals are causing harm, but also what are the possible alternatives? How can we replace these chemicals effectively in use and put in place things which are less harmful to farmers and to the environment and to consumers? So, it's useful to have these more flexible mechanisms for regulators to use and for other stakeholders to refer to and use in their work. The other point I wanted to make is that regulatory entities in most developing countries are weak. They have limited resources, human resources, financial resources, and their ability to effectively enforce their own legislation, as well as these international mechanisms, is limited. So they need all the help they can get to be able to do the job effectively. One of the ways of doing this is through UN agencies providing support, through projects, through other initiatives, training, and so forth. Another way of doing it is for countries to group their limited resources together in regional mechanisms, as is being done in Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, Western Africa, the Caribbean. And we need to find other ways, maybe through these kind of alliances, to help countries to understand where are the problems, identify them most clearly, and take relevant action as quickly as they can to remove the problems that are associated with HHPs.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Mark. So as you can see, we have posted our first poll. As mentioned, we are using Mentimeter, so you can vote on this poll either using the link that will be posted in the chat room, or you can go to menti.com and use the code at the top of the screen, 61826821, to vote on this poll. We would love to hear your responses, so please contribute to the poll and continue to answer question 1 in the chat as well.
So are we allowed to comment on this?
Yes, if you would like to, you're more than welcome to comment.
Yeah, because just one think about how do authorities in our countries react? Because normally I can see here that, okay, the UNEP probably is the better place in terms of the poll we're having here, and even FAO. But normally people are more concerned when we talk about the life of people. I think that WHO, because that is to every government, they are member of WHO, even FAO, but WHO deals with lives of people. If you build a strategy on them, it's easier to touch the decision makers. Because when it comes to environment, sometimes they may look like they are sensitive, but when it comes to decision taking, they don't think about environment most of the time.
One thing to add, perhaps, I mean, looking at these comments and the discussion as it's evolving, which, I mean, there are interesting points coming up for and against the idea of creating an alliance. From my own experience, having worked in the UN system, I know that the UN system itself has limited resources. It can't do everything for everybody all the time. It is good at facilitating, it's good at providing guidance, but I know also that there are many guidance documents out there that have been produced, which are not well used. They're quite technical. It takes experience and knowledge and resources to be able to effectively implement the guidance that's being provided. And also the UN agencies are effectively, the work that they do comes down to the individuals within those organizations and their own capacity and their own ideas. The idea of a global alliance to address highly hazardous pesticides, I think, has value because it allows a wider range of stakeholders to come together to focus on this specific issue, to bring their experience and knowledge from different perspectives. So, you know, we could have a whole range of different participants in such an alliance that can provide different perspectives, which are not necessarily well addressed when you allow just, you know, one group of organizations or individual organizations to lead on international processes. But we'll come to that in the next questions, I think, as well.
Great. So we have about 5 minutes left to discuss this question. The 5-minute warning has been posted in the chat. So please, can you post your final thoughts on question 1 and post your final thoughts for our poll. As you can see, there is an other option in the poll. If you have voted other, please could you indicate in the chat room who you think should lead the Global Alliance so we can understand your response there. And if Mark or Santos, if you have any concluding thoughts on this question or on this poll, please feel free to just jump in and then we will move on to the next question in a few minutes' time.
Yeah, in our proposal, the region is thinking about the FAO, UNEP, and ILO as the leads of this alliance.
I think I more or less gave my concluding remarks earlier, but yeah, nothing additional to say at this point.
Okay, so I think we can move on to our next question then. So Mark, I'm just going to hand over to you and you can give us the background for question 2.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you for that. So the next question is addressing whether, if we agree that some mechanism is required, and I think we have some divergent views on that, but let's assume that we do agree that a mechanism is required, is a global alliance the best type of mechanism? So let's look a little bit at what we're dealing with here. In terms of highly hazardous pesticides, they're a special case. We're talking about a range of chemicals that are designed to be toxic, that are intentionally dispersed in the environment, that are widely available and very widely used. That differentiates them from other hazardous chemicals in use in different sectors, for example, industry and so forth, where there is much more control over what happens to harmful products that are in use. In agriculture in particular, but also in public health to a slightly lesser extent, we have chemicals that are designed to be toxic, that are intentionally dispersed in the environment, and often used by people who don't have high levels of training. Sometimes they're illiterate, can't read labels. They have limited, they have equipment which is not necessarily the best equipment, and they're often or generally not able to protect themselves from the use of these particular chemicals. So this really is a special case that needs attention. We've talked about who should lead on such an initiative if we're going to have one. It could be UN agencies. We've got the conventions. Maybe they could host something. And we have SciCam itself, although SciCam isn't necessarily set up as an implementation mechanism that can host a secretariat or an alliance of some sort. So let's look at what the delivery mechanism might be. National action obviously is ultimately where change needs to be made. At the end of the day, any action that's taken on HHPs is taken by regulators at national level, and they need to be supported to be able to take the most appropriate action. Regional action can support that, and in some cases it is required to be adopted nationally. So for example, when decisions are taken regionally within the European Union or within the West African regulatory system, any decision that's taken there needs to be implemented nationally as well. And in some cases, we're also looking at global action, which is taken on the part of, for example, the conventions or other mechanisms that might be in place. So looking at what might be the best mechanism here, the question is a global alliance the best mechanism for generating action on highly hazardous pesticides? And we're asking, well, why is that the case if it is? Or why is it not the case if it isn't? And really what we're looking for here is the ability or giving national regulators and stakeholders who are in a position to make decisions. Because in some cases, for example, trading platforms like Fair Trade and Rainforest Alliance and so forth, they make their own decisions about what is acceptable to be traded through their platforms. So if they guide their farmers, their growers, not to use certain chemicals or to act in certain ways, then that is a decision that they have made, which basically bypasses national regulatory systems. They can make those decisions. A pesticide manufacturing company can make their own decisions if they're going to remove highly hazardous pesticides from their catalog. So there are ways outside national regulators where decisions can be made. But again, a global alliance might be an effective way of consolidating and informing others about the actions that have been taken, why those actions have been taken, and what other solutions might be in place to replace the removal of HHPs. So the question, again, as we move into the discussion, is a global alliance the best mechanism for generating action on highly hazardous pesticides? Why is that the case? Why is it not the case? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Yes, so we will now be discussing question 2 in the chat. The question will be posted in the chat for you to answer. And just as we answered the first question, please feel free to engage with the responses in the chat, engage with each other, as well as our presenters. And Mark, you can feel welcome to just jump in whenever you feel needed.
It's a very good question on this one. But when I was listening to the explanation from Mark, something came in my mind: illegal traffic. Because many of the things happening may have origin on illegal traffic as well, and which is also a big problem in our countries. We don't have enough legislation, and in those places where the legislation exists, there is no reinforcement of regulation and laws. And this is a very big problem. And the problem of HSPs is not only like environmental human health, it's also socioeconomic problem. With all consequences and all aspects that have to be taken into account. And we have also the lack of legislation, lack of monitoring, and the problem of corruption as well. And so there are many things that came at the same time at the table that influence the situation that we're seeing now. So the global alliance can probably create a better surveillance mechanism worldwide. We have global action, we have the regional one, and the local, the national one. So the combination of the three of them can help maybe sometimes to avoid that problems happening in one place can go and happen in other places as well. So I think the global alliance is needed.
Great. For anyone who's perhaps just joined us and is not sure what we're doing at the moment, we are answering this question on the screen in the chat. So the question, is the Global Alliance the best mechanism for generating action on highly hazardous pesticides? Why or why not? That has been posted in the chat for you to answer. Please type your responses. We are not doing verbal responses from participants, so please continue to type your responses in the chat and we will engage with your response. If you have questions for our presenters, please go for it as well. They are here to answer your questions and to discuss this topic with you today.
So looking at some of the responses that are coming through, I think Debbie's comment is interesting. Yes and no. How would a global alliance enforce, compel compliance and action to ban, phase out HHPs? It would be good if it can, as it can be independent and put pressure on countries to comply. So I think one of the important factors to consider here is that it cannot. A voluntary mechanism such as this is precisely that, a voluntary mechanism. SICAM is not legally binding. Any decisions that are, or recommendations that are made are maybe best practice, and they may be, you know, it may be that countries or regulators or other stakeholders with interests can refer back to SICAM decisions and say, you know, look, SICAM decided this, so it's the best way to go. However, there is no compulsion on the part of any regulators or any other framework to comply with that. It is voluntary. So maybe that's a weakness, but maybe it's a strength. And as I've said previously, I think from my own experience, voluntary mechanisms have significant strengths that allow them to have flexibility and maneuverability that legally binding instruments don't have. So, so I think the answer to the question there, Debbie, is that it will not be legally binding in any way, but we hope that its advice will be followed by regulators and that the alliance itself could support regulators in implementing its recommendations. So there's interesting feedback from the Rainforest Alliance, from Kim, saying that the Global Alliance can support voluntary standards like theirs in banning HHPs from their programs. It also stimulates action by companies in global agricultural supply chains to phase out HHPs in their supply chains. So action by individual partners in an alliance could then influence their own networks and take the action much further, which I think is a further argument for the creation of an alliance. Andrea, you've given reference to the Lead in Paint Alliance, which says a voluntary collaborative initiative to focus and catalyze the efforts of a diverse range of stakeholders. So they've obviously put some thought into this over time, and I think that summarizes very well what an alliance would do.
I see we do have some people with their hands raised. So we are answering our questions in the chat, and we're putting our responses in the chat. So if you're able to type your response in the chat, please go for it, and we will engage with your response.
Bianca comments that an alliance is a positive idea because it's most likely to be transparent, have multi-stakeholder participation, which is necessary to make the necessary impact.
So we have posted our next poll question. So please feel free to answer this poll question either by going to menti.com and using the code at the top of the screen to submit your response, or you can vote using the link that is posted in the chat. We would love to hear your thoughts, so please go ahead.
Another comment from Giftildor about whether a global alliance will be able to keep HHP producing companies in check, but how will it be implemented in smaller countries, and will there be penalties? So again, I think the regulatory capacity of smaller countries, of countries with less resources, is a problem, and that's why I think the UN agencies in particular, my own organization at the University of Edinburgh, CPSP, is supporting strengthening regional regulatory bodies to bring countries together so that they can share the limited resources they have to make regulatory decisions. And we're hoping over time that that will help them to be able to make and learn from each other's experiences, make decisions around pesticides and pest management issues. Will there be penalties? No, there won't be penalties because, as we've said, this is not a legally binding instrument. There's no law, there's no compulsion on the part of any of the stakeholders to adhere to what SICAM or what a global alliance on HHP says. It is voluntary. At the end of the day, the only legal decisions that will be made will be those that are made by national regulators. And they, you know, the framework may be able to support them, but it can't make those decisions on their behalf.
Great, I see some responses coming in for the poll, so please continue to post those responses. And just a reminder to please add your country to your response, and if you feel like explaining your answer, please do so as well.
I think Karina's point actually summarizes quite nicely the point that I was just making. A global alliance would be a good mechanism because coordinating efforts, focusing on the specific issues of HHPs, bringing strong evidence and putting pressure on policymakers. So it provides the evidence, it provides the support, it maybe puts pressure on regulators, but again, it doesn't force them to take any action. At the end of the day, it's their own decision, and each regulator in each country is sovereign to make their own decisions.
Okay, our 5-minute warning has been posted in the chat. So this is just a reminder to post your final responses to question 2 and your final responses to the poll. Mark and Santos, if you have any final thoughts that you would like to bring forward from the questions, from the responses in the chat, or from the poll, please do so.
It looks, what I see emerging from the discussion and from the poll itself is that countries really need support in these areas. and they're looking for ways in which that support can be provided. So I think increasingly that points to the desirability and the need for something like an alliance, which will be able to provide advice and support to countries to act on highly hazardous pesticides, which complements basically the work that's being done on the part of the conventions and the UN agencies. It doesn't replace them, but it does complement them. I think Andrea raised an important point in the discussion, which is how is it going to be funded? And I think that is something that needs to be considered because it's, it's easy for participants in big international meetings to say, let's create this new mechanism. And if there's no funding for it, then basically it may not even take off, or it may not be very sustainable. So its sustainability is also important, and that needs to be considered. Thank you. Santos, do you want to summarize?
Yeah, what I see is that, okay, most of people are saying, okay, there is a need to have that, okay, the existence of the Global Alliance will help the countries. And knowing some of the participants here and guessing that their senior office and their countries, it means, okay, there is a need of global alliance, because I think they believe if there's a pressure coming from abroad, it can help their activities,
sometimes the governments, they will.
Because I think that the government will normally, if something coming from internationally sounds better than coming from local technicians or responsible. I think the alliance also has the role of awareness and the pressure, because sometimes it's the mood that can help the decisions. So if something is happening in a country and that the government or the authority knows that, okay, this is also happening in that part of the world, okay, that's a bit easier or better than if it can only from the technical people inside the country. So I think is also the role of like awareness and pressure also.
Great, thank you so much for that. I think we can conclude this question and perhaps move on to the next question. And so I'll hand over to Mark once again just to present the background for question 3.
Thank you, Maxine. So as you can see, I had fun with this slide this morning. I was trying to think, who might be participating in something like a global alliance. And I looked for all the logos on the internet and posted as many as I could squeeze in here. So one of the questions that arises is, should this alliance be open to everybody, to any stakeholder that considers that they have an interest in this topic? What are the advantages and what are the disadvantages of that? And you can see that on this slide with the range of organizations I've posted would include some of the regional regulatory bodies like the CGPC in the Caribbean, the trading platforms like Fair Trade, biological pesticide producers like Coppert, industry representatives like CropLife International, and somewhere or other IBMA is the International Biopesticide Manufacturers Association, international consumers organizations, national regulators like ICAMA from China, the environmental protection agencies from national authorities or regional bodies, international organizations like the OECD, FAO, WHO, UNEP, and NGOs like WWF, Pesticide Action Network. So research institutes like the Indian Agricultural Research Institute, Society for Toxicology, international conventions like Rotterdam. So there's a whole range of bodies that might be included. And I'm sure that my slide is not comprehensive. There's many, many others that might want to be there. So the discussion really at this point is, how open should this be? Should any organization or company that considers that it has an interest in the topic of this alliance be allowed to join? If not, how do we limit that? How do we control the range of ownership and the range of participation in such an alliance? Once an alliance is created and it has its membership, how do we manage that membership to make sure that all of the participants are contributing equally or actively, are making a positive contribution to the purpose of the alliance? And maybe over time we will realize that partnership or the participation should change in some way, that maybe there are gaps in certain sectors, or maybe there's an overrepresentation in certain sectors. Will we have the ability to rebalance it in some way, to keep the alliance working on the objectives that have been defined for it? So that's the purpose of the discussion, and I'll open the floor to that.
Great, thank you so much. So the first or the final question has been posted on the screen. Should the Global Alliance be open to all stakeholders? What are the advantages and disadvantages of that? So we are going to move into the chat room again for the last time today, where we get to discuss this question. So please feel free to post your responses. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to post them as well. We will also post a poll question at some point, so keep an eye out for that. But please go ahead and answer question 3. We are eager to hear your responses.
Yeah, good question, Mark. But in our document, we stated that the Global Alliance should be open to all interested stakeholders, including governments, intergovernmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, farmers organizations, trade unions, indigenous people organizations, private sector, and sustainability standards. Then we say, stakeholders willing to become members of the Global Alliance should commit to its overall goal and objectives, and provide information on the specific experience, capabilities, and activities that may be offered in support to the Global Alliance. So yes, they can come, but they must have a very clear idea. They have to say what they have to offer to the Alliance. Mark?
Yes, thank you, Santos. That's helpful, and the fact that it has been addressed in the proposal that's been put forward to SAICM is clearly important, and we're getting some answers already on the chat, or some views represented there. So we're seeing it should be open to government, international organizations, and industry. I think one of the questions I would ask is, what does industry mean? Industry can mean many things, and I think when we're talking about pesticides, quite often there's an automatic assumption that we're talking about the chemical pesticide industry. But actually, as I've indicated in my slide, the industry can be many things. Industry can be the producers of biopesticides, the producers of other types of products, for example, mechanical traps or netting that can create barriers, the producers of resistant crop varieties. These are also industries, but they're not the same as the chemical industry. And I think that one of the issues that we are facing, and one of the reasons we find it so difficult to deal with harmful chemicals, is that there is an assumption that pest management depends on chemicals. And increasingly, that is not the case. There are many, many other ways of dealing with pests, with preventing pest problems from becoming an economic problem for farmers. We can use ecological techniques, biological techniques, mechanical techniques, cultural techniques. There are many options out there, and the range is increasing year by year of what's available. So we don't need to assume that pest control is only chemical, and we don't need to assume that industry is only the chemical industry.
almost everybody agreeing or having many stakeholders on board, but there are questions saying, okay, we have to differentiate the role of each one. And I think that they're talking about the tiering of the stakeholders in the alliance. But there is a very interesting question here raised by Arnold Poteke saying, I think industry, chemical industry, I'm not talking about organic industry, should not be part of such alliance. Experience from many years, decades, have shown that industry has been systematically trying to block any advance on pesticide regulation. So this is the reason why we have to engage them, because there's no way to let them out. Because if they are stakeholders, they're interested on this matter. If you don't involve them, you will never get their contribution. Because if they are producing what they produce, they're affecting people. So how to make people to handle their product properly is to give them tools to handle properly the products. But I think the exclusion doesn't help. Now the challenge is how to make them interested. How best we can engage them is the big question. I don't know what you think, Mark.
Yes, I mean, I think I agree that it should be a wide participation. And I'm interested. For example, there's one comment that came up here which says that the chemical industry shouldn't be a stakeholder because they're the ones that have actually blocked progress in these areas for so long. I don't know what participants in this discussion think about that. I'm a little bit surprised to see that, but it's an interesting perspective.
Yeah, that is Arnold Zapoteke.
Yeah.
But I was saying that the excluding doesn't help because they are interested part of the process, the stakeholder. And the objective of the alliance is to bring everybody on board. The big question is now to make them like playing a good role. Yeah.
Okay. Again, a similar view from Volker, also saying that they have a track record of hijacking discussions, gaslighting, blocking effective results, and therefore they should not be full members, but maybe as participating as non-voting observers.
Interesting, because these are the things that we have been facing in terms of the conventions. When it comes, okay, the continent's coming to want to include certain product in a list, start the fighting, the lobbying, yeah. But I think we should find a way of jumping out of that exclusion, how to make them involved, because for them to continue operating, they have to deal with governments in the recipient countries. So the alliance can help also in terms of awareness raising to the governments, telling them, okay, if they don't take measures, is the population will be suffering. If it affects population, is the economy of the countries that will be affected. I don't know, but I think there should be a new way of making everybody interested, involved, and interested on finding solution. So how to do it is the big question.
Okay, so there's a possible solution here, a proposal from Dina and Debbie, who sort of agree with each other on this, that there should be a clearly defined mandate for all participants, and they should be required to adhere to that. So that's an interesting way. Maybe we can have clear terms of reference for all stakeholders, defining what their participation actually means. And maybe that would help to keep things under control.
Yeah, Mark, you have been raising questions here. Can I ask you a question?
Of course.
From the baby's comment, I'm just thinking about a company which doesn't want to be anyhow involved in the alliance and even doesn't want to hear anything happening in the alliance. But the product from that industry is impacting in countries. What's the best way? What's the role the alliance can play?
So to some degree, I think if an alliance is going to be created as a result of this discussion in SciCam, then maybe it can define for itself, or some framework within SciCam can define what the alliance is set up to do. At the same time, we also know that SciCam has called on the UN agencies to develop a strategy or an action plan on HHPs. Now, we've heard that that is in the process of being formulated. I have been told that there will be something presented possibly at the forthcoming IP 4.2 meeting and definitely at ICCM 5. So we can propose or suggest or think that the alliance and the action plan will be aligned with each other so that the action plan helps to implement, so the alliance helps to implement the action plan. And I think that we also have to be conscious of the fact that at the end of the day, what we are trying to do is to give advice based on previous experience, based on best knowledge and information, ultimately to national regulators so that they take action. It's not the alliance that takes action. It's not the alliance that bans HHPs. It is the members of the alliance that will work together to give the best advice that can be used by members of the alliance and by national regulators to take decisions. And we just need to remember that that's the process. We cannot have a mechanism that takes away the sovereignty of national regulators. We cannot dictate to them in any legally binding way what the alliance thinks. It can only be an alliance that provides best information and best advice for regulators to take appropriate action.
Okay, so we have posted our poll for today. Sorry, Santos, just to jump in quick. We've just posted our poll. So if you want to vote on this poll, please use the link in the chat or go to menti.com and use the code on the screen. Santos, I'll hand back to you.
No, I was just agreeing and thanking Mark for the explanation.
So the votes are coming in on the poll. It seems that the highest votes are going to supporting countries to phase out HHPs and safer alternatives to HHPs. Close behind, stop production and export of HHPs, awareness raising about the impacts of HHPs. Slightly behind that, mobilizing support for farmers to transition from HHP use.
Yeah, but for me to phase out, first you have to stop producing. Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting question because it's almost like a chicken and egg situation. If countries ban a product, then its production will stop. If you stop production, then it won't be available anymore and you can deregulate it. But which comes first and which takes priority. I think you can work either way on that.
I know what comes first. Stop production. Because I know developing countries mostly sometimes they find schemes to come. So okay, they can put another level. The product can come under another level, and there are no laboratories in the countries to analyze the content of such product coming there. So if you don't stop at origin, upstream, they will always find ways to bring them downstream. People suffer. And we know that the recipient countries are less prepared. They have also the problem of corruption. And so there are many ways of that product. If they're still producing, they will somehow come in the countries like Africa, because we don't have the resources. We don't have enough technology and enough knowledge to know, to analyze, to go to the laboratory to test before allowing the product to come in the country. So if they don't stop producing, we still come to our countries.
Yeah, I think that this is a really interesting point, and I want to say something from my own knowledge and experience. And actually, there are discussions going on right now in Europe and in the UK about whether HHPs that are banned for use in these countries should be allowed to be produced and exported. Germany has just put in place a ban on exports of chemicals that are banned for use in its own territory. The UK, I've been having discussions with our government departments about this issue. It's under consideration. I'm not sure how fast or whether action will be taken. But here's an interesting point, and something that we've seen happening in other situations. When production from an industrialized country is banned or limited in some way, often what happens is that those companies will simply export the raw materials for that product to be formulated in the developing country. When that happens, that developing country becomes very defensive about that chemical because now they have a commercial interest in it. And very often, the production of those chemicals sits under a different ministry to the one that regulates pesticides. It's under an industry ministry rather than the agricultural or health or environmental ministry. And therefore, it becomes a political issue, a commercial issue, and it becomes even, in some cases, more difficult to deal with than pointing the fingers at industrialized countries that are exporting banned chemicals. So I think this is something to consider. And that's why I'm not convinced that stopping production is where we need to start. I'm not saying it's not important. It is important. But I think it's actually empowering the regulators to make informed decisions and to help farmers to transition away from the use of HHPs that may be the most effective course in the long term. Because as long as there's a market for these chemicals, they will continue to be produced.
Yeah, and sometimes they can come with lower prices.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah, when it comes like that, yeah. So I think can have to be combined actions. Awareness is important. Reinforcement of regulation is important.
We are still answering question 3 in the chat for anyone who's perhaps just joined, if there is anyone. So the question has been posted in the chat and everyone is busy engaging with the question as well as voting on the poll that is on the screen. If you would like to answer this poll, you can go to menti.com and use the code on the screen at the top, or you can vote using the link that has been posted in the chat. So please feel free to continue to respond to the question as well as the poll.
Interesting here that in the poll, the support food traders to eliminate HHPs from supply chains, only one vote. And remember that few weeks ago, I visited a farm. They produce dragon fruit, and they showed me two fields. They said, okay, this one we sell in the market, and we control the pest here. The other one, we don't use any pesticide because these are to export to Portugal. Because when the product arrives there, they analyze it. If there is something strange, there is pesticide. So the standards are different. Regulations also could play a role here, and controlling the food chain is also something interesting.
Yes, that's absolutely true, and we often see dual standards being applied to food that's being exported and food that's being produced for the local market, which is quite upsetting. There's no reason why consumers in Europe or the US should be protected while consumers in local markets should not be protected from the harms of pesticides.
And again, apply the standards from WHO and FAO.
Yeah.
Right, we only have a few minutes left of our discussion. So Mark and Santos, if you have any final concluding remarks that you would like to make about anything that we've discussed in our discussion today, or any of the polls, please go ahead and do so. And yeah, everybody, if you could post your final responses in the chat, and then we can close off the discussion in a few minutes' time.
I think in conclusion, I would say that this is basically through the discussion we've seen confirmation that there is a desirability for the establishment of a global alliance on HHPs, that an alliance is probably the best mechanism for delivering what it is that needs to be delivered in terms of advice, guidance to national regulators, and that participation in that alliance should be broad, but with an understanding that clear terms of reference, a clear definition of the roles of participants in the alliance should be agreed, so that there's clarity and we avoid the pursuance of specific interests of industry, for example, and conflicts of interest that might arise in an organization like this. I think there have been some really interesting points and recommendations that have come up in the discussion. I'm hoping that this will be passed on to those that are in the process of formulating the action plan at FAO, WHO, and UNEP, and that this will also be considered in the forthcoming discussions on the proposal that the Africa Group has put forward for the establishment of an alliance on HHPs. I'd like to thank Santos in particular for taking the lead in proposing the creation of this alliance to the SciCam community, and I very much hope that it's taken forward and that something meaningful comes out of it. Over to you, Santos.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to everybody, the Investors of Cape Town, for providing us this interactive platform and bringing this our issue so we can share it with other stakeholders. And we know that, okay, is a vehicle that we found and will help us. By the time we reach Nairobi, we'll have more people interested in supporting our initiative. And we hope that we will be able to convince the others to follow us as partners on this challenge. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much to our presenters, Mark and Santos. Thank you for your expertise today and for really giving us your time to have this discussion, a very, very important discussion. It's been great to hear and see everybody's responses. So thank you so much for just helping us organize this and yeah, just giving us your time and expertise. And a thank you to everybody who has attended this discussion. Yeah, we really appreciate your support and we really appreciate you joining our discussions and giving us your inputs. It's always great to hear what everyone is thinking. So just a thank you as well to all those in the background, Tatum Fowler, for her work that she's been doing in organizing this discussion and running all the technical aspects of it. Thank you so much to you. And thank you to our sponsors and to our team that helps make this possible. On the screen, you can see there is an evaluation poll. We would love for you to please answer this evaluation poll. It gives us great insight into how we can improve the network and these discussions, as well as the potential impact that these discussions are having. So please feel free to vote on the Zoom evaluation poll. It should have popped up on your screen. You can just click your response and hit submit. You can see on the screen that there is a save the date for the next discussion as well. The next discussion will be on the 23rd of February, and the topic is New Alternatives module of the registration toolkit. Please remember to register using the link that has been posted in the chat. Otherwise, you will not be able to access the discussion. So we will send out more information about the discussion closer to the time as well, but please register in the meantime if you can. That is everything from us. If you have not signed up to be a member of the Pesticide Discussion Forum yet, please do so. A link has also been posted in the chat, and you can also sign up for our Pesticide Weekly newsletter, which has great information being sent out. Thank you so much for being here today. We will send around a summary digest as well as the PowerPoint for this discussion, and we hope to see you at our next discussion. Have a wonderful day, and we will see you soon. Thank you so much, Santos and Mark.